That was me. Gary Cole says, hi, Dan.
Very cool. Wow.
Awesome.
It's cool. I'm sure a bunch of folks that I've worked with in the past can pop up in here. So, okay. Very good.
Awesome.
All right. All right. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from for our first Advantage, the last mile or the expert mile webinar. My name is Dan Brackett, and I am the food safety lead for our Advatics team. I also have here as our co-host, Trish Byron, who is the chief of staff for Advatics. So Trish comes to us with quite a bit amount of experience, 10 years, in fact, 10 years of experience working in the food industry, working with entrepreneurs to get their business up and going and commercializing their products and growing their business. So she's definitely not new to the food business. I also have here on our webinar team, Vinita Tyagi, who is coming out of, who's helping us out of India. She's part of our great marketing team, and she's responsible for helping to put this webinar together. She's not only helping us with the marketing of the webinar, but she's also the brains behind the technology for our webinar. So I want to say thank you to Trish and Vinita for making this webinar possible. Now let's get to our esteemed guest, Mr. Bill Marler. Bill is a prominent food safety attorney and an advocate for food safety. He has represented many victims of foodborne illness claims against food companies. And as I mentioned, Bill is an advocate for food safety. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that with Bill, how he made that transition. But he's an advocate for making our food supply chain safer, and also for driving legislative changes across this nation by working with Congress and our regulatory folks. So welcome, Bill.
Thanks. Good to see you guys.
It's great to have you here finally after all this time trying to get a chance to chat with you.
Happy to do it.
Bill, before we jump in, I got to tell you a quick story.
Sure.
When I was a junior food safety manager in a food processing plant, one of the things we were told was, make sure you get your act right, okay? Or else we may end up having to talk to Bill in the future, so.
Oh, I'm not that bad.
No, you're not that bad, but you definitely helped us to really drive, continuous improvement in food safety in our operations. So, so welcome, Bill. Really appreciate.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. So, Bill, we have some questions. Before we jump into some of those questions, there's some things that we want to talk a little bit about. We want to save some time for our attendees. to actually, to pose some questions to you. I don't want this to be just about us and Advatics and, our questions that I have. I
Sure.
want the folks here who have taken time out of their busy schedule to basically to directly ask questions to you. So if you don't mind, we're going to put aside about 20 minutes to do that. Okay.
Great.
That's
Great.
okay. All right. And some other announcements. We're going to have a poll that's going to pop up in either in the chat or it's going to pop up on the screen. Please take the time to answer some of our poll questions. Okay. So Bill, we're going to jump right into my first question. So if you don't mind, please share with us, how did you make that transition, right, from being a food safety attorney to actually becoming an advocate and driving changes in our food safety laws across this country?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. And it kind of came over time. I mean, one of the things about doing the kind of work that I did, and this was starting in the 1990s in the Jack in the Box case, I really felt that, holding people accountable in the legal system would drive change. And, after the Jack in the Box case, and then there was the Odwalla case, and then sort of the snowball of all of that litigation over time, I really sort of began to realize that, suing people, suing companies wasn't going to be enough. Certainly from my perspective, my goal there was to take care of the people who got sick. And that's really, as a lawyer, that's my moral, ethical, legal obligation. And that is still something I do. But it really wasn't, in my view, having that effect of really driving the kind of change that I felt like needed to be done in order to prevent the next outbreak. And I think it really was at that point that I started, going to conferences, food safety conferences in industry and in public health, sometimes going in front of groups that, were pretty hostile to me. I went to groups that would, the first 3 or 4 rows would walk out of the meeting, or I'd get booed or people would yell at me but I guess I looked at that as I must be having some positive impact on them somewhere. So it really was the desire over time to not see these horribly injured kids and people dying from doing the simple thing of eating food. And so that's when I started getting involved, with pushing certain kinds of legislation, E. coli 0157, and as an adulterate, spending $500,000 doing testing on E. coli in hamburger to see if there were other forms of E. coli that were available, that were there, giving that data to, FSIS. So, and then, the work I did trying to help push the Food Safety Modernization Act. And there's still things I'm doing now. So yeah, it was transition over time, but it was, I think it's an important thing, that I feel like I've been able to do in my career.
And thank you for that, Bill. I know that you have made, helped to make tremendous changes, especially with the Food Safe or the Food, Safety Modernization Act. So thank you again. And I know the work continues, right? So, so this is a food safety culture webinar. And I know you have been talking about food safety culture long before it became a hot topic. I kind of went back and looked at some of your, talks and speeches and one-on-one conversations. And, way back when, like, as far back as 10, 15 years ago, you've been talking about food safety culture. All of a sudden, it's the hot button topic, right? So I want to ask you this, right? So let's talk about how, in your opinion, why do you believe, that regulatory agencies now, I read those investigative reports from the FDA or these regulate health department, entities, and I all seem to always see food safety culture mentioned in those reports. Why do you, in your opinion, why do you believe this is such a hot button topic and why it's trending now at this time?
Yeah, and I certainly, won't take credit for it. There were some pretty smart people early on. Professor Griffin from university in the UK. Doug Powell of Barf Blog fame, Frank Yanis, who was at Disney and then Walmart, now at the FDA. There were people talking about food safety culture, for a long time. And to me, it sort of started to make sense that that like HACCP isn't enough, that
Yes,
HACCP is a great idea, but you got to have the interest and wherewithal to make HACCP be alive, that it's not just a thing you do and then stick it on a shelf somewhere. It's a living, breathing document. And it's that culture of food safety that makes the HACCP plan being a living document. And
yes,
and I think as it relates to sort of my view as a lawyer litigating these cases, it was in some respects taking like depositions. I get the opportunity to put people under oath and ask any question I want. And it was not like they didn't have the data available. It was just that things weren't focused on making food safety a part of absolutely everything they did.
yes,
There were other pressures. There were
yes,
stockholder pressures. There were, price pressures. There were, bottom line pressures. There were sales pressures and all that sort of thing. And I think from my perspective, the food safety culture tries to winnow those things down and focus on the things that are important, which are not just sales, but producing a product that is safe.
yes.
And, I'm glad that there are people that are talking about it now, because I think in the long run, it's going to prevent foodborne illness from happening in the future.
I agree. I completely agree with you, Bill. I know I didn't share with you, when we were talking about doing this webinar, I said there's some questions I have for you. So I'm going to stray just a little bit from the script here.
Sure.
But as a junior QA manager coming up, right? Someone in the food safety business, how do we convey to management the ROI, the return on investment of a robust food safety culture?
That is a question I get asked a lot. And a lot of times I'll be at a conference and I'd given a speech, I'm on my way out the door or, waiting for the cab, and somebody will come up, look around, and then they'll ask me that question. Is like, how do, they don't want to be seen asking that question. And, the problem that I think, and I think we need to be open about this.
Yes.
The problem is that there are companies that live and breathe food safety. They have a food safety culture. They have HACCP. They have all sorts of stuff. And an outbreak will happen. Something will go wrong. They'll get a product in that came from someplace else that's contaminated already, and it got through the system. It can happen. Then there are companies that don't care about food safety at all, and they seem to never have an outbreak.
Yes.
So, when a food safety person goes, hey, Bill, how do I convince my CEO that it's important, food safety is important, and we need to spend X to do it? That's a tough thing to do. And because you can't guarantee that investment is going to solve your problem.
Yes.
But I can tell you that it's just like everything in human nature. There's a moral and ethical reason to try to always do your best, to try to always elevate your product to be the most healthful, food, to be the safest food that's available under the circumstances that you find yourself.
Yes.
And, that's the kind of decision that a board of directors has to make, a CEO has to make. And, if you're a junior food safety person or you're a food safety person in a company, what you need to do is stand your ground and say, this is important. This is why it's a moral imperative. It's an ethical imperative. And in the long run, it decreases our chances of making a mistake and causing a problem and having Bill come knocking on our door.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Bill. Let's get into our third question here for you. Back to our script, by the way. So the people, you have litigated a lot of foodborne illnesses cases, right? And I think that during that litigation, you probably have a good understanding of what a good food safety culture is, what a bad food safety culture is, and what is a great food safety culture, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can have a great food safety culture and still have a foodborne illness or food contamination incident, right? And why that is, right? So, in your opinion, just based on your experience and seeing all these, different companies, organizations out there, programs and food safety culture implementation, what do you believe a robust food safety culture, should look like?
Yeah, it's really a commitment by the board and management. It's really the leaders at the top that this is like the imperative, that food safety is, not second to sales. It's the same as sales. It's that, our sales are tied to safety, our safety is tied to sales. And that's what we're going to push. It is those companies that have that kind of culture that I have to admit, I very seldom see. It's the rarity where I am, litigating against a company that, that is invested in food safety culture, that lives and breathes food safety culture, that go to the conferences, that pay attention to, guys like you and companies like yours. That's the rarity of, I wind up seeing them. The people on the opposite end of the equation, I can speak for days about the things I've found, and you can look at just some examples. Peanut Corporation of America's salmonella outbreak in 2008 and 2009, 700 people sick, 9 dead. They knowingly were shipping contaminated peanut butter, knowingly. You pick listeria outbreaks where listeria was in a plant for years and years and years, without, paying attention to the cleaning requirements. So it really does require, in my view, people at the top really feeling that food safety is important and empowering the people with knowledge about food safety below them, the food safety managers, the food safety. These should be the company's heroes to, really protect that, especially a branded product. You don't want to be known. I mean, let's be candid. Let's give an example of that's happening right now. Infant formula. You don't want to be that named company that is known for that product.
Yes.
And having a food safety culture doesn't mean that you're absolutely or 100% sure that you're not going to be that company, but it gives you a far better opportunity to not have your name on the front page for weeks and weeks and weeks as a company that, poisoned, sickened, and possibly, killed babies.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's an unfortunate, unfortunate incident
Yep.
occurring right now. And I mean, I couldn't think of something, more traumatic than having, infant formula that's out there contaminated. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, that's a very good point, Bill. I want to get into, this question here is, I think a lot of folks that I have worked with in the past, right? They feel like once you're in regulatory compliance, that that automatically that translates to having a great food safety culture, right? And one incident that came up, actually it's not an incident, it's something from an experience that I had is, for example, Campylobacter, right? We had, I had a company basically say, hey, Dan, at the time, Campylobacter is not it's not an adulterant, right? And we can allow Campylobacter to go out on their products because it's not an adulterant, right? That they can say that they have a robust food safety culture because they're in regulatory compliance. How do we distinguish between the two?
So, and I think the regulators would agree with me on that. Regulation or even the, what the standards are, generally accepted standards for a company, those are, in my view, kind of minimum levels of, of food safety. And those regulations, those industry standards, without a robust food safety culture that's paying attention to that and paying attention to the things that can be problematic. I'll give you a sort of example. One of the things I say a lot is it's really difficult. Humans generally have a very difficult time, looking out around the corner of the thing that might happen to them, and to plan ahead. We're just bad at that. And I think we have to adjust that even in a food safety culture and a food safety company. You have to set up systems, which is kind of why HACCP exists, to try to project into the future, like what could happen that could be bad. And, that ultimately is, getting back to the argument about food safety culture, that's ultimately what we all have to do, whether you're a lawyer or whether you're a food safety director. You got to be able to plan ahead, think about the thing that could bite you later, and plan accordingly to make sure it doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I from my experience, Bill, and I don't know if you have seen this, is that folks have well documented programs and sometimes even well implemented programs, but they don't keep doing the risk analysis.
Yeah.
And so the programs are almost set in stone. They're not dynamic, right? And so regulatory compliance changes.
Yep.
And I think that the onus is on that food safety manager or that risk manager to make sure that we keep up with the ever-changing landscape of regulatory compliance.
Yeah, and there's one thing I would add, and I think we talked about this, before, is, if regulatory compliance absolves you of any responsibility if there's an outbreak, it's the idea of due diligence, that if you've done due diligence, you're free to go. That doesn't work in the law. It just doesn't. You could, live up to, all the regulatory standards you want. You can live up to all the industry standards you want. But if your product goes out in a contaminated fashion, whether it's Campylobacter that is or isn't an adulterant, or Listeria with 0 tolerance, 0157 with 0 tolerance, and you make somebody sick, you got a problem. You got a problem.
Yes. So I think you answered one of the other questions I had for you, but let's get to the other questions here. And I think this is actually going to be our last question before we get to, we ask our audience here to chime in with their own questions. Everyone is probably thinking or have this question on their mind, right? Does having a well-implemented food safety program or a well-maintained food safety program, does that really protect our companies from lawsuits, right? And I think you kind of touch a little bit on it, but if you could just dig a little bit deeper into that.
So the answer is, there are a lot of companies that I've never sued. Lots. More companies I haven't sued than I have. There's more companies that haven't sickened their customers than have. So logically, if you are paying attention to regulatory requirements, industry standards, and you have a robust food safety culture, you're paying attention to the details, you're going to the seminars, you're implementing the newest technologies, you're paying attention to details, that's likely that you're not going to be in a situation where you sicken your customers. And I think that's kind of common sense and, good human behavior. Does it guarantee that you won't? No, it doesn't. But it also doesn't give you an excuse not to do it. Just because, you can do everything and still you can create a problem doesn't mean that you just go, oh, hey, there's nothing I can do about it. We don't need to pay attention to anything. Yes. So I urge people who are at that point where they're like, damn, there's nothing I can do to get away from Bill, to really understand that there's a moral reason. You don't want to be in a situation where your product is sickening people. You don't want to be on the other side of a table of, of a 21-year-old woman who ate your romaine lettuce and is going to lose her kidneys and never have children. You don't want to be in that spot, not because of, because it's expensive or terrible. You just don't want to be in that spot as a human being. And I think people need to really kind of wrap their head around that and realize that it's not about the lawsuits. It's not about, your brand being, besmirched. It's about that infant. It's about that young woman. And we just you can't be 100%. We're never going to be that way. We're humans. Things are going to happen. But I'll give you one example, and I'll leave you to let the people ask. Here, this is a real thing. So from 1993 to 2002, 99% of my law firm revenue was E. coli cases linked to hamburger. Today, it's zero. What happened? Yeah, there were a lot of lawsuits. Yeah, there were a lot of recalls. E. coli 0157 was an adulterant. Industry hated it. Hamburger was going to cost, as much as gold, but it didn't. And we're not seeing those outbreaks, those illnesses. So regulatory compliance, industry acceptance, consumers paying more attention to cooking have all created a situation where the only person harmed by this has been me and my bank account, which, think about it. If you hate lawyers, take away their money. So I just look at it that way. And I said, there's a way to make this thing right. And I think, the E. coli in hamburger is just a wonderful example.
Yeah. And that's a great example, Bill. And that example probably is being taught in all the food safety courses across the nation. And,
Should be.
Yeah. So, but but I said I had one last question for you before we get to our attendees. But I do have another question, because you touched on something there when you talked about the changes in the meat industry with E. coli. How do you, as a food safety risk manager, how are you able to change that trajectory, right, for due diligence? For example, years ago, the produce industry, back in the days in the food industry, you couldn't get folks to do ATP testing, right? And folks are like, it's not going to ever happen. Or we couldn't get folks to do finished product testing on produce, right? They said it's never going to happen. The product has short shelf life, right? But now we see those changes. Now they're becoming almost, I should say, part of your programs, ongoing program. It's no longer a big challenge or financial challenge to do that. How do we get folks to think of due diligence in those terms?
Yeah, I mean, testing is not 100%, accurate, and it's a snapshot in time. It's like an inspection, but it is a way of confirming that, your HACCP plan is operational and working. I mean, let's be honest, that testing isn't, you're not going to test your way, to food safety. It's going to help. It's going to be good. And in using meat as an example, once they started 0157H7 test and hold, the numbers of recalls dropped significantly. And the cost of that dropped significantly, simply because they weren't having to recall all that product and destroy it. They got a positive test. They could send that lot to, thermal, cooking and deal with it. Leafy greens, fresh fruits and vegetables, it's tough. It's tough. I get it. And testing isn't going to solve the problem. But I think we've gotten to a point now for leafy greens, especially, and fresh fruits and vegetables, is the kind of that last mile of food safety may well be the most difficult and politically problematic. And that's looking at land use and looking at, who our neighbors are and how
Yes.
we deal with that. It's really good to see that the FDA really recently has begun to sort of make it clear when these outbreaks happen that the outbreaks are more likely than not caused by environmental contamination. That's a big deal. That's a big
Yes.
deal. And so, it's a rambling answer to your question, but the reality is, I think we move in the right direction when we're paying attention to new information and all the information that may well be around us. And, I think using the hamburger example as like, hey, we can do this. I just think now we have to implement it in other areas as well.
Thanks for that answer, Bill. Appreciate it. So this is the point in the webinar that I zip my lips and open it up to our audience here, or attendees, I should say, for them to pose their questions to you. So I'll let Trish, if she doesn't mind, I'll let Trish basically tell us what questions we have.
Awesome. And thank you to the audience for your participation. And we've been getting some awesome questions in throughout the conversation. So Bill and Dan, buckle up. All right, so our first question, do you have any thoughts on whether COVID has changed our perspective of food safety and food safety culture?
Yeah, as all of us have been living, through this whole pandemic, and, probably we would all be together in a room somewhere, but for the pandemic. So clearly I think that it's been good that early on, it became obviously clear that COVID was not going to be a foodborne illness that, we had to worry about. But then there were some interesting, studies about getting COVID within a restaurant setting with, and so that started to drive things. I think the interesting thing that is really going to come out of COVID is sort of a couple of things. One is, the lack of inspections over the last 2 years, whether or not that's going to change the way inspections are done, whether or not we really need to have inspectors on the ground doing this, or are virtual ones going to work, or maybe some modification of that. I think that's one thing that COVID is going to teach us. I think we have to be careful to know that COVID times had health people and the public health focused on COVID, understandably, and so a lot of foodborne illnesses weren't fully investigated or investigated at all. Because I pay attention to this, the last 2 years, the number of foodborne illness outbreaks were down. And it's going to be interesting to see where the studies come as to whether or not it's because of lack of inspections, lack of investigations, lack of people going out. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays. And I look forward to seeing, the scientific studies and the data and what we can learn from that, and maybe help us, from an experimental point of view, come up with strategies to make our food safer. It's going to be interesting. I'm hopeful that this recent downturn from the Omicron virus has some staying power, because I think we're all a bit beyond tired of, COVID.
Absolutely. Our next question, Trish.
Excellent. Sort of along the same lines, with the recent Family Dollar warehouse infestation and adulteration, do you see most companies extending their food safety program to their warehouses and 3PL locations? That's a recent example, so I thought that would follow that question well.
Yeah, that was pretty stunning. And I think there was a serious failure of their food safety culture that I think, obviously is not something that, think about that. That's certainly not something that, the people, in the boardroom or C-suite would be interested in having flashed all over the front page. But I think they have to probably look pretty hard to see whether or not they ultimately are accountable. Let's just hope that there are no illnesses linked to that and their products. But what a waste of, what a waste of food, what a waste of product. It's bad. And I think that, food safety culture isn't just what happens in your little facility. It extends all the way back to who is growing the product, all the way forward to who's transporting it, to when it leaves your facility and goes to either a restaurant or a store for sale. Food safety culture, food safety, is a continuum from, to not use a cliche term, from farm to fork.
Dan, anything to add?
No, I think we can continue on with the questions. I think the dollar store is another one of those big issues that are flashing across our news screens, and hopefully they get to resolve it, because the other downside to that, Bill, is, and I'm sure everyone's aware of that, is that there's a loss to the labor market too, where folks are losing their jobs. Stores are closing down, and a loss to the small communities that depend on those stores. So
I agree. Something not to take away from any of the questions, but something I was talking to somebody about this earlier today is, like food waste. We have these outbreaks and recalls, and I always think back to just even thinking about the recent romaine lettuce outbreak, 2018. 240 people sick, dozens of people with acute kidney failure, 5 deaths. And they said all romaine lettuce from Yuma needs to be destroyed. Well, after 3 years of litigation and, suing the grocery store, the restaurant, and moving my way back upstream, through the course of litigation to the farm where it was grown, we've learned a lot about what the likely cause of the outbreak was, and it primarily was downstream of a cattle feedlot. But if you think about that, if we had that visibility of that supply chain, visibility at the time of that outbreak, you would have said, these romaine lettuce producers, you should throw away that product, but all the rest of this romaine lettuce that was grown in Yuma is fine. And you just think about how many tons of, absolutely fine romaine lettuce got thrown away. And it just, what a waste, what a waste.
Yeah. Bill, just quickly on that, on the leafy green, leafy green products, right? Produce items. How do you feel about industry regulated programs? For example, we had the leafy green marketing,
right.
Agreement, right? What is your opinion on that?
So if the government's not going to step up, obviously industry can. I'm a firm believer in having whatever regulatory or inspection decisions should be as close to the consumer as possible. And what I mean by that is it should be the focus of regulatory action. Inspection action is how to make the food safer for the consumer. And when, for example, you have a big box store requiring that you be audited, but that you can hire the auditor and you have to pay for it, that is not the incentive you want. You want the big box store where that product is being sold to a consumer to be the person who is doing the audit or hiring somebody to do that audit, because it's their responsibility to make sure that product is safe. And so, that I think is one thing to do to really create as close to possible, allow the consumer as close as possible to be that person who's making a decision. That's why regulation exists, because when a consumer gets sick, they usually think it's the last thing they ate. They don't know what made them sick. They're not scientists. And so, to have a consumer being the person responsible for making the capitalist system work by saying, I ain't buying that product anymore. That product made me sick. They have incomplete and frankly inaccurate knowledge. Yes. So that's why regulation either at a governmental level or an industry level is really important. My personal druthers is that we should empower government to do that and not industry to do that. Not because I have complete faith in government to do it correctly, but it's, in my view, it's closer to the consumer. It's responsible to the consumer, and that's why.
Thank you. Trish, do we have another question?
Absolutely.
From the attendees?
Absolutely. Lots that pertain to the conversation you have been having. But I am going to pick this one. A high employee turnover has impacted our ability to get past basic training and move to working on the consistent food safety culture. Do you have a strategy for do you have a strategy for new employee onboarding that speaks to food safety culture?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. I mean, during COVID times, both from a safety perspective and, employees, deciding to go do something else has really impacted, all facets. And I can't imagine how it must be. There was a great article in the New York Times focused on one of the big leafy green manufacturers and the problems that they were having keeping and retaining employees. And then when you overlay that with the need to train employees on safety, and you still have that turnover, it's a real challenge. I'm not sure I have a great, other than to understand that that's a challenge, I'm not sure I really have a great answer for how some lawyer would think about resolving that issue. I think it's obviously, how do you retain employees? That's a challenge I have, and that's a challenge companies have. And usually it's a financial one in part, it's a cultural one in part, depending upon the nature of the employment. But then it's a matter of getting all of your employees in a food safety context to buy into that culture. I think it's a challenge in turnover. You see it in a restaurant setting, you see it in a manufacturing setting. And, I think we all recognize that it's a challenge that, companies are going to struggle with now and frankly are going to struggle with it in the future.
Yeah. Okay.
Dan, anything to add to that?
No, Trish. Are there any other questions for Bill?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So sorry, let me have one to pick here. Of the companies that you have brought suits against, are there common themes, issues, or mistakes that these companies did, had, or made?
Yeah, they didn't pay attention to detail. I'll give you, this is like out of my old bags of tricks, but this is a truism in my experience of 30 years. It'll be 30 years in January from the Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak of January 2023. And if there's one truism about what I do is that in every single foodborne illness outbreak, there always was a warning sign, a blinking light months and months and months before an outbreak happened. They just don't randomly happen. I'll give you an example. In 1992, the state of Washington, because it had a number of E. coli 0157 cases, small ones, linked to ground beef, the state of Washington changed the food code from 140 degrees to 155. They disseminated all that information out to restaurants all over the state of Washington and to restaurant corporate headquarters throughout the country that had restaurants in the state of Washington. Jack in the Box got that info. They got it. But what did they do about it? Nothing. They didn't do it. They didn't pay attention to it. They sent out information to all restaurants that their 2-minute cook time was most important. How quickly did they change it to 2 minutes and 15 seconds after the outbreak happened? Like that. They had an opportunity to change the course of history, and they didn't do it. In 1996, the Odwalla E. coli outbreak happened. In November of 1996. In the spring of 1996, they tried to sell their juice to the US Army. The US Army came out and did an inspection and said that their plant sanitation program made their product not fit for military consumers. You would think if they weren't going to be able to sell it to the Army, they might not want to sell it to little kids and pregnant girls and women. So I could talk all day about that sort of thing. Back in the days of hamburger and meat, ConAgra had a big meat plant. 19 million pounds of meat was recalled. They kept having 0157H7 positives every day for 30 days. They would destroy that lot, but the next day they had positives again. You would think after 30 days of positive tests, somebody would go, maybe we should do something different. I've got days of examples like that. And I think, unfortunately, that gets back to the food safety culture part of it. Are there people paying attention to things like why is the state of Washington increasing the cook temp from 140 to 155? Gee, why is the Army not buying our juice? Gee, why are we having 30 days of positive tests? Should we do something? That is the part, in my view, that screams for the need for food safety culture.
Yeah. Bill, I think I have to ask you this question because a lot of our attendees are working in facilities, processing, distribution facilities that are GFSI certified, right? And the GFSI, some of these GFSI schemes have changed to include an audit element of food safety culture, right? And so they're probably listening here and going, hey, I'm getting 95s on these audits. I'm getting 98. I'm good. I don't have to worry too much about my food safety culture. What do you have to say to them to really say, hey, listen, those 95s don't protect you, or protect your products?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is that, I don't know if every restaurant in Jack in the Box in 1993 was getting great inspections. They probably were, but they weren't paying attention to like one detail, like, gee, science has changed, something's going on, we got to pay attention to that and why. I think that's absolutely true. You just because you're an A student every day doesn't mean that you can't make a mistake, and I think that goes for audits as well. Yeah, you still have to pay attention to detail. You got to be proactive. If you're in the industry, you got to pay attention to the journal articles that come out. You got to, why do these outbreaks keep happening in Yuma, in Salinas? What's the common denominator here? Should we be buying product from Yuma and Salinas? What do we need to do to make sure that we're supporting the farmers and the processors to produce food that's safe for our consumers? Those are the questions that I think you have to keep asking yourself, and you have to, you have to sort of keep focused on that and keep asking yourself those questions again and again and again.
Okay, thank you. Trish, any questions? We're at the 10-minute mark here. I think we can take maybe a couple more questions for Bill and
Absolutely.
before we wrap up.
Maybe a couple to round us out here. Do you have any books or resource recommendations for where there are some details of outbreaks where you could gather some learnings to be able to share with operators and teams?
So, I mean, not to plug a book that's about me, but there's a book called Poisoned by Jeff Benedict that was written about the Jack in the Box case that I think gives a lot of real good understanding of like what was going on behind the scenes. There was things about the Jack in the Box outbreak that I learned in the book about like what was happening inside Jack in the Box that I didn't get out of them by even putting them under oath. So I think it's a real interesting read. It's also going to be turned into a Netflix series that's going to come out in 1993. So unfortunately, it has a whole bunch of video and audio of me 30 years ago. So yeah, so don't laugh at the way I looked then and the way I look now. So, but I think Frank Yanis has a book on food safety culture that Frank and I pre-pandemic would teach a class together at Michigan State University that the people used as a guide, in that there's some good books on food safety that have just come out. A dad who lost a son in the Jack in the Box case, Darren Detweiler, who went on to get his PhD in food safety and has written a book on food safety, is important. There are a number of books out there that I think, help people understand it. But, there's, in some respects, I don't know if necessarily you need a book for this. And I remember, and probably you and your audience might remember, a guy by the name of Dave Thino, who was the vice president of food safety at Jack in the Box, came in after the outbreak to quote unquote save them. And, Dave became a friend. That might sound kind of odd given what I was doing. And I wound up speaking at his funeral in front of, hundreds of employees of Jack in the Box, which I think probably also seems odd. But I think it's because of the connection Dave and I had. A little known story about Dave is when he was at Jack in the Box, in his briefcase, he would carry a picture of Lauren Rudolph, a young girl that died in Jack in the Box. And anytime Dave had to make a tough decision about food safety, he'd pull that photograph out of his briefcase and go, what would Lauren want me to do? And that might be a little hard for everybody to think about, but that's kind of what you have to do in some respects to get you and your CEO and your board to pay attention to food safety. You don't want to be in that spot. And, Dave, I miss Dave a lot, and I miss him every day. He was a good guy. So,
and I think the whole industry misses Dave,
yeah.
And his contribution, to food safety. But on a personal note, Bill, I think that, most of our attendees here have never been to court, and God forbid that they ever have to go to court to defend their programs. But I remember being there in front of a judge and lawyers to defend a one. It was just a one-off event or experience, but that stuck with me for the rest of my life. Actually, thinking about how do I develop and implement programs so I don't have to be in front of a judge or getting deposed by lawyers again, right? The biggest question I have is, how do I convey or communicate that experience to many of these younger QA managers that are there that probably will never, ever have to stand in front of a judge to defend their programs, or, to push to them or point out to them that they need to validate those programs, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So how would you, can you speak to that a little bit?
That's a great, Dan, that's a really good question. And, it sort of also kind of harkens back to HACCP. You don't have a real HACCP plan unless you're documenting what you do. We're been involved in a large and the only E. coli outbreak that I've been involved in recently in the last 5 to 10 years that relates to hamburger, and a big production of hamburgers. One temperature taken, and 4,000 plus people served. That's a problem. That's a problem of documentation.
Yeah.
Did they maybe do testing more than once? Maybe. Yeah. But without documentation, you're not, using your HACCP plan appropriately, and you're not fully engaged in the food safety culture. Paying that kind of attention to detail, documenting what you do and doing it and making clear why you're doing it, that's going to help you if you ever do wind up in a weird situation in a courtroom. Showing documentation of, hey, we did all these things, will save you probably, if the question is, did your product actually sicken somebody? If you're doing all these things and it's a one-off case, it's likely that you're going to not be found liable in that situation. Yes. Yeah. But, but on the other hand too, if it's an outbreak situation and your product was the cause of it, showing all the documentation of what you did to prevent it will save your company from a claim for exemplary damages, punitive damages, which aren't covered by insurance. And you want to avoid that. Also, we didn't talk about it, but there's also the risk of criminal liability. And we've seen that in situations in companies that knew they had a problem and did it anyway. We also have seen it in companies that just made a mistake and got hit with criminal sanctions.
Yes. So Bill, we're coming down to our last few minutes of our webinar, and there's so much that you have to share, or have information to share with our team here. But we just want to thank you very much, for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to be here with us, to join us and share your insights and knowledge and experience with our audience, definitely with us here. So thank you again, really appreciate it. Have a great time, wherever your travels take you. But we really appreciate you, and hopefully we can have you back again sometime. But I also want to thank Trish and Vanita for making this webinar, possible. Without you guys, without you being on our team, this probably wouldn't have happened. And I want to thank also our executive team, Manish Kapoor and the executive team for making this happen. And thank the audience for joining us, taking time out of your busy work week to join us here. So stay tuned. We're going to have upcoming, webinars. And thank you again to everyone for attending. Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it. Bye-bye.